Welcome to the show that teaches you the things your parents and teachers are too afraid to, the Helios blog. Today, Piers Morgan in another Israel Palestine debate. This should be fun.
The reason she's alone is because she's difficult.
Women are not accepting the bare minimum.
Women fuck men they respect.
All the women who say things like, I'm strong, independent, I don't need no man, like, y'all impress me.
Women just gaslight each other and say what they want to hear.
Two things can be true at the same time. That is a fact that has been all but abandoned in the fevered and polarized commentary on the Israel-Hamas war. This weekend, Israeli forces raided a refugee camp in Gaza and successfully freed 4 hostages who've been abducted at a music festival on October the 7th. The Hamas-run health ministry says that 274 people died in that raid, including children and civilians. The IDF says it killed fewer than 100 in total, including Hamas terrorists. But whatever the real figure, it's obviously horrific. This was a refugee camp. Children were killed. They are clearly innocent. That doesn't make it any less horrifying that 4 innocent Israelis were snatched by terrorists at a music festival in the first place, and no less of a triumph that Israel has now brought them home. These things can all be true at the same time. And the exact same logic applies to the war itself. Israel had no choice but to declare war on Hamas for perpetrating the worst massacre of Jewish people since the Holocaust. But it doesn't have a blank check signed in Palestinian blood to commit repeated atrocities without accountability, especially now that members of Netanyahu's own government are calling out his failure to explain the Israeli endgame. To the very many people on both sides who have attacked me for saying that, my question is simply this. What exactly is wrong with having a moral conscience about innocent people suffering? And more importantly, where is yours? Well, joining me now to debate this, journalist and broadcaster Emily Austin, Palestinian-American commentator Omar Badr, and the host of Part of the Problem podcast, Dave Smith. Well, Dave, let me start with you, actually. A lot of people are part of the problem, it seems to me. The longer this war has gone on, the more entrenched people have got into their various tribes, and it's got increasingly toxic. There's no admission by anyone in those tribes of any wrongdoing on their side, and there's no attempt to come across the bridge and forge any kind of settlement, resolution, or peace. It seems to me like we are entering a really depressing phase of all this war. What is your view?
Well, I can't disagree with any of that. It's certainly depressing. I mean, listen, this has been going on since October. We're 9 months into this thing now, so it's been depressing for a while. And I agree with everything you said in your opening, that, of course, perpetrating violence against innocent civilians is wrong, no matter who does it. And that ought to be the basis for Western civilization. I mean, especially for people who like to kind of brag about Western civilization and the aspects where it's superior to others. The thing here, though, right, is that, as you say, Israel doesn't just have a blank check signed in Palestinian blood, but objectively, the reality seems to be that they do, and that they have unconditional support from the United States of America, the global superpower, no matter what. Even if our own president asks them not to do something and they do it, they still continue to receive this unconditional support. And of course, but as I've said to you before, Piers, and I think this has kind of been the fundamental truth throughout this entire conflict, is that the only way you can really support Israel in what they're doing is if on some fundamental level you value Israeli life more than you value Palestinian life.
Okay,
and if that's your starting point,
here we go again.
Fine. But if that's not your starting point, then you don't look at a mission that got 4 Israelis back and killed a bunch of children as a success.
Well, you see, that's where I have a real, again, I've used this phrase many times in this war, a moral quandary, and I'll tell you why. Should there be any limit, given that Hamas kidnapped these people, kidnapped young women, they kidnapped babies, they kidnapped Holocaust survivors, as well as murdering and wounding thousands and thousands of people? Should there be any limit to what Israel should be able to do militarily to rescue those hostages? From all the footage coming out, they planned this because they had information about where they were being held. They then sent special forces in to get them, came under heavy fire, and as a result of that, there were air cover sent in as well. And I'm just curious, what should be the limit on Israel to go and rescue these innocent kidnapped hostages?
Well, I mean, look, the limit should be, in general, what the limit over this conflict should be is that if your number one priority is to get back the hostages, I think this whole campaign would have been conducted in a very different way than it has been over the last 9 months. But, look, what's wrong, the essence of what makes it immoral to take these hostages is that these are innocent people who did not do anything to forfeit their natural God-given rights. But that also has to apply to innocent Palestinians who were not involved in October 7th or had no blood on their hands, were not members of Hamas militant groups. And these are, and we're describing millions of people who fall into that category. And so, in an ideal world, the limit would be that you could only go after those people who were directly responsible. Now, in war, that's rarely the case, that there are no innocent casualties. However, I think a reasonable approach would be to expect Israel to do what they always claim that they're doing, which is just a blatant lie, which is that we're doing everything we can to avoid civilian casualties.
Okay.
But very clearly, that's not been how they've been conducting this war.
All right, Emily, let me bring you in here. I mean, look, I was joyous when I saw that these hostages had been rescued, particularly Noah Agamani, whose story touched the world. Seeing this beautiful young woman being taken off on a motorbike, absolutely desperate with fear, and we all feared the worst for her. And then the added human dimension of her mother having incurable brain cancer. And very sadly, it appears she's too far gone with the cancer now to even really understand what has happened with her daughter coming home, and wanted to live until she did get home. So the whole thing was tragic, but has the joy of her obviously being rescued. But when you look at these numbers, I mean, think about the Palestinian Health Authority numbers, is that historically, going back before October the 7th for decades, or several decades anyway, when these figures released by the Palestinian Health Authority, which is Hamas run, have been verified independently, they've come back as reasonably accurate. I mean, not completely, but reasonably accurate numbers. We don't know whether these are reasonably accurate, the ones they're putting out now, but Israel admits to killing at least 100 people. We don't know how many of those are Hamas. And they say 274. Either way, it's clear from the scenes at the hospital that there have been a lot of women and children, innocent people, clearly, caught up in this. And so the same question for you, really. Yes, I'm joyous at the return of hostages. Yes, I think Israel absolutely has a right to go and get them. But at what cost to innocent Palestinian life?
What's interesting about these debates that end up becoming pretty chaotic is that everyone expects usually the Zionists, and I can't speak for anyone but myself, to be unapologetic about Palestinian casualties. Now, that's not me. That will never be me because I'm not a monster. Now, of course, Israel needs to do its best job to protect innocent civilians. Now, when I say innocent civilians, I don't mean the journalists or op-ed writers that are keeping hostages in their home. If you're complicit in keeping hostages or you're complicit in terrorism, to me, you're not a civilian, you're a terrorist as well.
I agree.
Now, with that being said, at the same time, my point is never, in my life, I will never say the Palestinians deserve it. This is what they get because of Hamas. My point is always the same. All of the blood spilled on both sides of this conflict are Hamas's fault. It's only Hamas to blame, because if it wasn't for October 7th, the IDF would not be in Gaza. If it wasn't for the hostages being...
They're just using a pretty girl so that people don't pay attention to how bad things actually are. That's the impression I get anyway.
In civilians' apartments, guess what, Piers? There'd be no civilian casualties. And I also want to point out one thing, just a food for thought. Is it only IDF bullets that penetrate? Excuse me, does Hamas not fire back? Do you think Hamas is not responsible for casualties as well? So my point is never that it's justified. It's always the same. Every ounce of blood spilled needs to be blamed on Hamas, and the world needs to put international pressure on Hamas, because if the hostages
only Hamas is at fault, nobody else
were released time and time again, this war could have ended. Instead, where do they put them? In a refugee camp to maximize the casualties that everyone's going to face. Before I go to Omar,
I do think it's very disingenuous when I hear the argument, if Hamas just released the hostages, this war would be over. Israel's stated mission It's not just to get the hostages back. It's to eliminate Hamas. So
Correct.
Getting the hostages back is one part of it, but it's not. It is just not true to say if they handed them all back tomorrow, Netanyahu would not want the remaining Hamas terrorists to still be there. He would continue, as he'd made very clear, to execute this war until he got rid of all of Hamas. So I just don't think it's right.
But is that unreasonable? Did America not want Al Qaeda dead after 9/11?
You know, I'm just saying it's not right though. No, that's true. But I'm just saying it's not accurate. When I hear pro-Israeli guests say, "Well, if they just handed back the hostages, it'd be over." That it's not as simple as that. It wouldn't be over.
I'm saying it would minimize civilian casualties. Of course, you want to eradicate Hamas because if you don't, October 7th will be December 7th, will be February 7th, et cetera, et cetera. My issue is that they make sure, Hamas makes sure to maximize the civilian casualties. And for some reason, the blame goes solely on the IDF.
Okay, let me bring in Omar. Be waiting patiently. Omar, you know, it seems to me there's already now a split in the Israeli war cabinet. Benny Gantz has resigned. You know, people view him as more moderate than Netanyahu and Ben-Gvir and Smotrich and so on. That there are other, you know, very right-wing members of that cabinet who, not the war cabinet, but the more general government cabinet, who are pushing Netanyahu to a very bad place, they feel. And I sort of share that view. I don't know where this ends. And Gantz has made it clear he's resigned because he doesn't see any end game. He doesn't understand what life is going to be like at the end of this war. And that should worry all of us. What is your view of where we are with this split now in the Israeli hierarchy?
Yeah, that is precisely where we are, Piers. I mean, Gantz split off because he understands that there is significant discontent with Netanyahu domestically. There is significant international discontent with him, including from the United States. And he's hoping to reap the rewards if that pressure eventually ramps up to a point that actually pushes Netanyahu out of power for him to be there to basically replace him and become the future leader. But I just want to emphasize the fact that we are precisely here because Israel does not want to end this war. They've set unrealistic goals. They said that they're going to continue this onslaught until Hamas is defeated militarily, until they freed all the hostages militarily. And in the meantime, this onslaught is killing tens of thousands of innocent Palestinians day in and day out. And because Israel can't achieve its goals, the idea that we just have to sit back and watch this horror continue endlessly is completely ridiculous. I mean, I was listening to Emily speak, and all you have to do is just reverse the scenario for just a moment, Piers. Right now, as you and I are speaking, thousands of Palestinians have been kidnapped out of the Gaza Strip and are placed in Israeli detention centers where they are undergoing daily...
No, it's fine. It's only one party that's at fault, so everything's fine. Just have one side cease doing what it's doing and everything's fine.
Torture. There's a piece in the New York Times exploring the absolutely horrific torture they're undergoing, including acts of sexual abuse that they are enduring. And right now, and by the way, several dozen of them have died in Israeli custody, almost certainly due to the abuse that they are enduring. And if you were to ask a question right now, is Hamas justified in invading Israel to rescue 4 Palestinian detainees out of the thousands that are held by Israel? And what kind of civilian cost would that be worth? Imagine that scenario and imagine that several hundred Israelis were killed in the process. How many people would celebrate the release of those Palestinian prisoners?
Well, I would ask you,
say,
okay,
great, the hostages are retrieved?
it's a valid point, but I would also ask you another question, which if we do flip all this round, and it had been the IDF who had gone over the border on October the 7th, murdered in the most horrific, barbaric manner, 1,200 Palestinians, the majority of whom were completely innocent people, kidnapped over 200 and brought them back into Israel, and wounded nearly 7,000 more, many of them catastrophically. Are you really saying that anyone on the Gaza Strip would have wanted any limitation put on Hamas for exacting revenge?
You are making an absolutely incredible point, Piers, because you don't have to imagine that scenario. Back in 2014, when Israel initiated a military operation against Gaza, they killed 2,200 Palestinians, including more than 550 Palestinian children, and that does create a sentiment within Gaza of people who want vengeance. And that's why you see some people, react to October 7th as saying, what do you expect after everything that Gaza has endured at the hands of Israel? And
I mean, we've already heard the stories of what is actually, like, what people say that Gaza's actually like. It's actually like a certain scene in a certain, let's just say, you know, like 1940s. You know what I'm talking about? Let's just say that.
Right now, we're putting our finger precisely on the point, is that if we want to compare atrocities back and forth, frankly, I don't think Israel fares very well, because there's no question that Hamas has committed atrocities against Israelis, but Israel's atrocities against Palestinians have been far greater, far more frequent, and extend over a much longer period of time.
Okay.
And if we're serious, just last point, Piers, that is really important.
Yeah.
If we're serious about wanting to end these atrocities, you have to deal with the underlying problem. And the underlying problem is that Israel's recipe for Palestinians says they are not allowed to ever be free. They must live under siege and occupation forever. And if they don't like it, they can either leave or be subject to Israel's brutal military operations. And until Israel starts seeing Palestinians as equal human beings who can live in freedom on their own land, I don't think this thing is going to end. We're going to be stuck
I'll
in this
come to
cycle for a
David
very
in a
long
moment,
time.
just to get a quick reaction to that from Emily.
I actually agree with Omar to a certain extent that if you go back and forth and compare atrocities, it'll be an endless conversation because there's plenty to go back and forth with. I'd also like to add, talking about if you flip the narrative, let's say, which thank God Israel has the Iron Dome, let's say they hadn't. How many civilian casualties on a daily basis would Israel be facing?
More, what's the word? Propaganda.
I also want to point out some serious hypocrisy. Everyone's talking about, why can't we equivocate Palestinian lives to Israeli lives? And absolutely we should. Why are Palestinian lives any less or more valuable than an Israeli? Then how come in every ceasefire exchange, for some reason, they equivocate one hostage to 6,000 Palestinians who are arrested for either alleged terrorism or valid terrorism? If you actually want equality and fairness, then let's address the facts. Palestinians live better lives often in Israel than in Palestine itself. It's not a ridiculous point.
There is
how
an
many
imbalance
rockets a
of
day does
power
Hamas
that
send
changes
into
how many.
Israel? Sorry, there's
No, I'm sorry.
lag.
That's a complete misreading of the situation. The reason why there is a discrepancy in the hostage exchanges is because there is a huge disparity in power. Israel can just go into the Palestinian areas and kidnap thousands upon thousands of Palestinians who are held without charge or trial. If Hamas were capable
Omar,
of doing something like that,
how many rockets a
you
day
probably
does
would see
Hamas
a
send to
one-to-one
Israel
exchange
to
of
target
people.
civilians?
All right, well,
Omar, how many
I'll tell you what,
rockets a day? I want him.
I think we're
is he
getting
aware?
into the kind of tit for tat argument, which is one you both
We're talking
highlighted
about
actually in
civilians.
different ways, and I don't want to read it this way. Let me ask Dave this. It's just breaking news now. The United Nations Security Council on Monday has adopted a US drafted resolution backing a proposal outlined by President Joe Biden for a ceasefire between Israel and Palestinian militants Hamas in the Gaza Strip. I call them terrorists. Russia abstained from the vote. The remaining 14 council members voted in favour, and the US finalised this text on Sunday after 6 days of negotiations among the council. So a sort of significant move there to support President Biden's way to try and bring about a ceasefire. But it does beg the question, what happens next? I mean, I don't think there can be any future here that involves Hamas having any power whatsoever, nor do I think there can be any future with Netanyahu in charge of Israel. And I'm not entirely sure, given the scale of what's been going on over the last 7 months, dwarfing anything really we've seen in many decades, I don't know quite how we get to peace. How do we rebuild trust and get to some sort of peace? I mean, you must have thought about this a lot, Dave, like we all have. What do you think?
Well, I mean, look, it certainly seems like a daunting task, and it seems right now that we're about as far from peace as we could possibly be. I think I may have said this to you when we were doing your show when you were in New York a couple months back. But, you know, like last year, I went and did comedy shows in London, and then I flew over to Ireland and did shows right there. And, you know, you guys are right next door to each other. And there was a time when it seemed like you guys could never achieve peace. You know, the truth is that as many pro-Israelis like to brag about, at Camp David in the late 70s, Israel did make a land deal with Egypt, a land for peace deal, and that peace stuck. They went to war 4 times in a little over 20 years, and they haven't been to war ever since. And so as bad as things do seem right now, I do believe that there's a path where there could be a deal made and there could be a lasting peace. But the bottom line is that what you have to understand, and I appreciate Emily saying that, like, there's been a lot of atrocities on both sides. I don't think anybody would deny that. And I don't think anyone would deny that Hamas has some responsibility for atrocities that they've committed. But the point is, the underlying fact that you can't get away from here is that this is an asymmetrical conflict. Israel has occupied Palestine since 1967.
Uh-oh. But of course, admitting the truth, no, we can't do that. We can't, you know, we just revisionist history. That's all that we need to do.
Not talking about a few months after a war or even a few years after a war. We're talking about longer than the Soviet Union occupied Eastern Europe. And the idea that people say, well, if Hamas just surrendered today, the war would be over. Like, let's even say that's true, which I'm not convinced it is, but let's say that's true. And then what? Live in subjugation forever? I mean, look, the height of the Netanyahu doctrine was 2 weeks before October 7th, when he went to the United Nations with a map of greater Israel, including Gaza and the West Bank all being Israel. That was the peak of the Netanyahu doctrine. And what he was telling the world and the Palestinians was, it's over, you lost, we won, we made our deals with the outside Arab world, no one's coming to save you. You live in subjugation forever. And the culmination of that was October 7th.
Okay.
And that's not to remove responsibility from Hamas.
Respond?
Yeah,
but you cannot remove responsibility from Israel
I'll
either.
let Emily respond to that.
I want to ask David, you just said Israel is occupied. Obviously, you hear that narrative every day. And I often hear chants, specifically here in Manhattan, we don't want 2 states, we want all of 48. When the UN came up with the partition plan and nobody was happy with that, and they gave land not only to Israel, but Jordan too, I can't help but to think, why does nobody criticize the occupation of Jordanians taking the land from the Palestinians? How come it's only anger once it's the only Jewish state in the entire world, in the entire globe, that suddenly it's occupation? And also, can somebody enlighten me how we occupied the land that never had a prime minister, never had a government, never had a currency, never had one person with historical ties to the land called Palestine?
Sure.
I just can't wrap my head around this occupation narrative.
Well,
that doesn't exist.
let me see if I can help. So the reason why people aren't currently occupied about or currently outraged about Egypt occupying Gaza or Jordan occupying the West Bank or something like that is because it's been over since 1967. So, like, yeah, if you want to go back historically, there were bad things that were done by lots of groups of people. However, since then, it's been the Israelis doing the occupation. That's not a narrative. That's just a description of reality. And as far as your point about, like, you know, that there was never a currency or there was never an official state of Palestine, as I've said before, I just find this to be the most un-American, un-enlightenment way of looking at things. I mean, all you have to do is read the...
It's just comparing facts.
It's not. No, it is completely irrelevant. And here's why it's irrelevant. Read the Declaration of Independence. That's all you need to do, and it will completely dispel you of that. The Declaration of Independence starts off right away.
Well, the Middle East is not America.
Hold on, let me just say this. Let me just...
Frankly,
No, okay, fine, it's not, but these values transcend America. It's the idea of natural rights. Man is born free because these are God-given rights, and governments are just something we institute to protect our rights. And if the government isn't doing a good job of that, then the people have the right and maybe even the duty to overthrow that government. No offense, Pierce, you guys, you've had your wins too, but this one was ours. And so I'm just saying, no, listen, it doesn't matter whether they were dominated by the Ottomans or the British Empire or Jordan or Egypt before then. These are human beings who deserve natural rights, and they have absolutely no rights under Israeli rule and haven't since 1967 due to the Israelis.
Okay.
What happened before that is
Palestinians
irrelevant.
actually have full rights in Israel, but okay.
Well, I tell you what.
Okay.
Emily,
I'm
on that
talking about the
point,
Palestinians in Palestine.
well, hang on. Here's what I would say about that. It was very clear very soon after October the 7th when Israel was able to control food, energy, water, and things like that, and turn that tap of supply on and off, that actually Palestinians do not have the same free rights as Israelis. Otherwise, Israel wouldn't have had the ability to do that. Now,
But
Israel,
how much of the percentage of that, the water and electricity?
Israel would put up an argument about why they do that, but you can't dispute that was what they're able to do. Omar, there's some more details coming out about this. Well, Omar, I just want to bring you up to speed on the details coming out of this announcement. They're talking about a full and complete ceasefire, the release of hostages held by Hamas, the return of deceased hostages' remains, and the exchange of Palestinian prisoners. The plan includes 3 phases that would end with a multi-year reconstruction plan for Gaza, which has been largely destroyed due to the fighting. The second phase includes a permanent end to hostilities, as well as full withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza. This is according to a text of the US draft resolution. I mean, first of all, do you welcome the broad brushstrokes of that statement?
Certainly do, Piers. I want to address this directly, but I just have to go back to just one thing that Emily had said, because I think it's really, really important not to gloss over it. When we talk about Israel's occupation of the Palestinian territories, when you look at settler colonialism in the United States and the fact that Native Americans were pushed off of their land, nobody cares that Native Americans did not have an officially recognized government or what currency they had or this or that. These are people who are living on their land who are being pushed out by an occupying force, and that's all that matters. And what's unique about the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territories, particularly in the West Bank today, is the fact that it's settler colonial expansion. Palestinians are being systematically pushed out of their land and out of their homes, so Israel can build more and more settlements to take over Palestinian areas. And 80% of water in the West Bank is taken to be used by Israel and by the settlers. This is Palestinian water. Every Israeli policy, every inch of the West Bank that Israel takes over by force, every drop of water that Israel takes is a violation of international law. These are war crimes that Israel is committing. So to pretend to conflate all of that with whatever historical examples there have been of other occupations and not, you're missing the point that Israel is actively replacing Palestinians with Israelis
but let's also,
as an effort to confine Palestinians
but let's
into
also
smaller and
get to the
smaller
point
areas.
of this breaking news.
I also want to address that America did not give the land back. Okay, but I want to move.
Listen, I want
to move on.
Okay, but I want to talk about Listen, you've all had a good chance to talk. I want to talk.
And as usual, although I expected this to become a screaming contest, and it actually didn't, surprisingly, but we're going to end the video there. Hit the like, hit the sub, hit all the notifications, drop me a donation. Like Hunter M, Adrian, Tom and Bobby, Dylan, Renaissance Press, Brian, Andrew, and Alan. Shout outs to you, most recent purchaser of Strategist Guide to Seduction. Thank you. Go buy my books at bit.ly/heliosbooks. If you'd like my early access content, I offer it on Patreon. That's patreon.com/theheliosblog. And if you'd like me to give you good advice, just access my coaching services. That's at theheliosblog@gmail.com. Thank you so much for listening, guys, especially if you listen to the end. I really do appreciate it. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you next time.